everyone. Thank you, Shaquille, and thank you to the Shura Council of Southern California for inviting me here today. It's really an honor to be here. I want to share with you pretty much an overview of the U.S. immigration detention system and CIVIC's work, and then share a few stories that highlight the injustices of this system, specifically for Muslim men in Southern California. So every day, approximately 34,000 people are held in U.S. immigration detention facilities across the country. These are a network of about 250 county and city jails, as well as for-profit prisons run by two corporations, GEO Group and Corrections Corporation of America, that some of you or most of you in the audience probably know about. Prior to the 1980s, there were only about 30 to 40 people in immigration detention on any given day. Now there's 34,000 on any given day and about 400,000 people in immigration detention per year. So what changed between the 1970s and the 1980s? Well, in the 1980s, two major private prison corporations, GEO Group and CCA, were born. And they began lobbying the US government for laws that would expand not only the immigration detention system, but our incarceration system. And in the 1990s, that lobbying led to one new prison being born every 15 days throughout that entire decade. There were two laws that were passed in 1996 that I want to talk briefly about, because it was those two laws that created the immigration detention system that we have in place today. So those two laws did a number of things, and I want to highlight three of those things. One, it expanded the class of people who could be put into detention and deported. So it allowed for legal permanent residents, so people with green cards who've been living in the United States, who have family, maybe came here as children before they could even remember. It allowed for those people to be put into immigration detention and deported if they were convicted of a certain crime. Those individuals will have already served their time for that crime, and then they're put into what's supposed to be a civil form of confinement, immigration detention. The second thing that this law did is it required, actually mandated, that anybody claiming asylum at a port of entry must be mandatorily detained. So if you come as somebody who is seeking asylum, which is basically refugee status, to our nation's border, and you say, I'm afraid to return to my home country, I've been persecuted, this law requires that you will spend your first night in the United States in a jail or a prison. And you may spend the next week, months, years in immigration detention. Yeah, the third thing that this law did is it took discretion away from immigration judges to grant bond, which is basically bail, which is release from immigration detention. So about half of the people in immigration detention each year, so about 200,000 people, cannot go before an immigration judge to seek release. The only time that they will be released is if they're deported or they win their case. But their case can take months, years, and so we see people in immigration detention for much longer periods of time, and many more people. I'd like to read a poem from a dear friend of mine, Sylvester. We know he's an asylum seeker from Kenya, and he was in immigration detention for 9 years. So this is a poem that he wrote just a couple months ago. He was released earlier this year. Humiliation. It is devoid of humility. It is a sick and twisted form, fingers and hands running across my body, sometimes 10 times a day, to let me know that I am subject to anything they please. I cannot bear to leave my cage, peering eyes and surveillance in the most intimate moments. The body is under attack, and the mind and soul take refuge deep within. Sometimes the body wants to revolt from this treatment, assert its power, but there will be consequences. So instead, you have to let it dissolve in your body. Writing about the abuses against us was the only way to let it out, slowly, so slowly. It is still coming out. I wonder if it will ever end. I wonder if I can ever purge the humiliation. So it is my honor to share this poem with you, and I want to share a little bit about what Sylvester has been up to since he's been released from immigration detention. So we first met Sylvester in 2013 when he was detained at the Etowah County Detention Center in Gadsden, Alabama. It's a county jail. And he had been in immigration detention at that point for about 7 years. He had spent most of his time in immigration detention in Southern California in 2 different private prisons. But in 2013, the Ninth Circuit ruled that anybody who had been in immigration detention for at least 6 months, whether or not they were in mandatory detention, could go before an immigration judge to seek bond. So what did U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement do? They picked up Sylvester and about 50 other men who could have benefited from this ruling, and they transferred him and these 50 men to Alabama, where this ruling did not apply. So he continued to languish in immigration detention. So when we met him, we decided with him to launch a public pressure campaign to pressure ICE to transfer him back to California and ultimately release him. We got his story featured in World Magazine, in multiple news articles, and we pressured ICE to bring him back. He was transferred back to California, and while he was in immigration detention in Alabama, we had a volunteer visiting him weekly, and he now calls that volunteer his mom. And when he was transferred to Southern California to the Otay Detention Center in San Diego, we had another volunteer begin visiting him. And we had a group of volunteers come to his court hearing to show the immigration judge that he had a community of support on the outside. And the immigration judge actually granted him the lowest bond possible, which is $1,500, and we were able to raise that money in 15 minutes, and we were able to get Sylvester released. And since he's been released, in his poem he says there will be consequences, but he knows that as somebody who is now free, he has the greatest responsibility, as do all of us, to speak out for those injustices. So he filed with us a multi-individual complaint on behalf of people who are detained at the Etowah County Detention Center, where we documented race-based harassment, inadequate medical care, and a pattern of routine physical assaults on the men who were detained in that facility. He also came back with us to Alabama and did a protest outside of the facility where he was able to speak to the men in the facility who were looking down at him, men who he knew, looking down at him through the window. There was also a row of guards who had detained him, who had imprisoned him, who were listening. But he said, "I'm here because I'm not going to stop fighting for you. I'm going to continue to fight for you until you're free." And I think that's a really strong message. Of course, there was retaliation. Our affiliated visitation program at that facility was terminated by the county because of our complaints and because of the protest. We had another one of the named individuals in our complaint get re-detained the day that we filed the complaint. Luckily, his attorney was able to file an emergency habeas petition. He was released the same day he was detained. But the government is afraid, I think, of people speaking out and showing what's really happening behind closed walls, behind closed doors. So I'd like to share briefly about what Civics Mission is. Our mission is to end the isolation and abuse of people in immigration detention, and we do that through these community-based and volunteer-run visitation programs, as well as through independent monitoring, storytelling, and advocacy. We currently have affiliated visitation programs operating in 42 immigration detention facilities in 18 states. Including actually 3 immigration detention facilities right here in Orange County and an additional 2 private prisons in Southern California. Currently, many of the men who are in immigration detention in Southern California are originally from Southeast Asia or Africa, and many of them are Muslim. This past week, we released an in-depth investigation into the Adelanto Detention Center, which is right here in San Bernardino County. It detains about 2,000 men and women in immigration detention. And we spoke with a number of Muslim men over the last 6 months. 22 of them reported religious freedom violations, including that there was no imam to lead Islamic worship services. As Shaquille mentioned earlier, Muslims detained at this facility are regularly prohibited from convening every Friday for their prayers. Hopefully, we're going to be seeing some change, not only in Adelanto, but across the country on that. And actually, one former GEO Group officer came to us, and we did a recorded interview with him, where he spoke about a time where a officer just had a bad day and there were Muslim men praying, and because she was having a bad day, she threw them into solitary confinement. So a huge violation of their religious freedom rights. Also during religious holidays that require fasting during daylight, the Adelanto Detention Facility does not make adequate provision for the men to eat after sunset. So some of the men will have to purchase food from the commissary, but many of these men don't even have money to purchase food, so a lot of people will go starving during these religious holidays. We've also documented what seems to be a very disturbing pattern or practice by ICE not to release Muslims who pass their credible fear interview. So if you come to our nation's border, you seek asylum, you will be put into immigration detention, but you can be released if you pass what's called a credible fear interview and you have an address to go to, a friend or family. Pretty much, I would say 90% of the Muslim men that we've spoken to at the Adelanto Detention Facility have passed their credible fear interview, have a family member, maybe not in California, but definitely in the United States, and these individuals are not being released. So they land up having to go before an immigration judge to seek a bond, and then the immigration judge has been placing exorbitantly high bonds on these individuals, $40,000, $50,000, and this is very hard for somebody who doesn't have collateral to go to a traditional bail bondsman. So this is in effect basically detaining these men indefinitely. We're determining right now some steps that we can take with the Shura Council and with communities across the country, and particularly in Southern California, to address this issue. But the men and women in immigration detention are taking it upon themselves. Actually, within the last 3 weeks, nearly 1,000 men and women have gone on a hunger strike at 4 different immigration detention facilities. It started at the El Paso Detention Facility in Texas, where 54 South Asian asylum seekers from Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan went on a hunger strike. Then a few days later at the La Salle Detention Facility in Louisiana, 14 Indian and Bangladeshi immigrants began another solidarity hunger strike. Then a few days later at the Hutto Detention Center in Texas, 27 women, and now it's grown to 400 women, are on a hunger strike right now. And at the Adelanto Detention Center as well, there are over 400 people on a hunger strike at this moment, protesting the shameful conditions inside this facility and calling for their release. ICE's response, of course, has been more retaliation. They have actually a policy which is beyond how I can understand that this is even a policy, but they have a policy when a large enough group of people go on a hunger strike in a detention facility to cut off the water at that facility. So not only are the men and women going on a hunger strike, they also are not able to drink when they need to. So people are getting dehydrated. We're getting calls from people who they just, they're on a hunger strike, but they definitely want to drink water. So this is a lot to take in, I know, and I know all of you are dealing with these issues in your community, in prisons across Southern California and across the state. So I want to leave on hopefully a hopeful note. We at CIVIC believe that the immigration detention system is going to end. We don't think it's going to end necessarily with an amendment or a bill, but it's going to end through people like everyone in this room here standing up and saying, look, this isn't right, and we want to see change. And what CIVIC is doing is we're doing 2 things. We're monitoring human rights abuses through a database. We also have a hotline in all 250 immigration detention facilities where people can call us for free, and we can complain directly to the government for human and civil rights abuses, and we can document those. So we can go to Congress and say, look, your $2 billion taxpayer dollars are going towards perpetrating these amounts of human and civil rights abuses. And we're also doing alternatives to detention work, so getting people released from detention so that we can show the government that there is no need to be holding these people in immigration detention. And as I kind of started off, there were about 30 to 40 people in immigration detention on any given day in the 1970s. So we have a blueprint in this country for what a country without immigration detention looks like. And I truly believe that we've done it before and we can eradicate immigration detention again. Thank you so much.